I think going forward, there's a lot that the arts can do. Um, Philosophically, art is one of the only places that we can still ask these questions, play out politics, and negotiate ideas. Further, art isn't about communicating, climate disaster. Art is about creating space for people to think through some of these issues.
Another episode of the Conscient podcast. I'm with Marnie Badham, who is a Canadian been living in Australia for a long time. Good morning, Marnie.
Good morning, Claude. Great to hear you.
Yeah, well, we've known each other for a long time. You were at Commonweal Community Arts in Regina when I was at the Canada Council. But we also had many exchanges over the years about community engaged arts. And when I was in Australia, you helped me there. And so it's nice to reconnect. And you sent me some of your work, and I'm really fascinated by the research you're doing. And there's not enough time to cover all the ground, but I'll start by asking you to introduce yourself, just to give us a brief idea of your background and what you do, and then we'll jump into the topic of reality and ecological grief. So, Marnie, who are you?
Sounds great. Well, before we begin, I'll say that I'm an uninvited guest on the unceded lands of the Bunurong peoples here in the Eastern Kulin Nation. So that is in Elwood in Australia, in Melbourne, otherwise known as NARM. And I want to acknowledge elders past and present, as well as future on the unceded lands, which I'm calling in from today.
Sorry, I should do the same here. I'm on unceded Algonquin and Anishinaabe territory, which here in Ottawa. So thank you for doing that. We should always do that. Thank you.
Absolutely. And as I said, I'm an uninvited guest, which means I'm a visitor to Australia, and I'm originally from near Treaty 4, which are the lands of Cree, Lakota, Dakota, Nakota, and of course the Métis Nation. That's where I grew up until until I was in my early 30s when I came to Australia. And I guess I describe myself in a range of different ways. So it sort of depends on where I am, what I'm doing, and who I'm talking to. So a little bit of a shapeshifter in terms of different roles that I've held. But ultimately, I currently calling myself sort of an artist researcher in the way that I think about engaging with questions and people in the world from a creative perspective. But my work's often described as socially engaged art.
Well, I saw on your website you talk about the intersection of social engaged art, participatory methodologies, and the politics of measurement, which are all fun things for me because they do cross, and they're all very important in the sort of arts and cultural world in terms of policy and theory and intellectual pursuits, but also in very grounded practices. So, speaking of grounding, what is reality to you?
Yeah, I don't really know. I think I don't. I think as an artist, I'm always interested in um, the idea of like futures and future imaginaries, and thinking about art as actually a place um, where questions and politics and relationships can be played out. When I think, more practically about the concept of reality is. Um, I guess I'd say, like, more recently through the pandemic, and as you know, Melbourne had a series of public health restrictions. So there was a lot of staying at home. And for me, as a person who lives by themselves and who's actually quite used to working transnationally, zipping around the globe in different unsustainable ways, it was a really excellent exercise in reality, in thinking about and reflecting on self, reflecting on place, and very much engaging in nature. It's the first time I've actually done any serious gardening, let alone purposeful walking and meditation, which wasn't about getting from one place to the other. It was actually about spending time with self in place and being able to think through some of these bigger questions that we may avoid in our busy day-to-day lives.
Mm-hmm. Well, the reason I brought it up as one of the themes of this season is that I'm going through a process of accepting certain realities, but I'm also interested in not just the scientific reality, but the types of realities or types of views of the world that might be alternative or interpretive or, like you say, futuristic, speculative. Those are all, and I've had so many interesting answers to that question about how do people perceive and accept different types of realities. So it's been very helpful, and I want to move on to action, but I needed to kind of work through that, and I'm getting there little by little. And what about ecological grief? Is that something that you've had experience with as an academic or in your own life?
I think I first experienced ecological grief personally was last year, actually. Um, and like I said, as a person who lives in another country with family in Canada, with a lifestyle that was typically not grounded in place in the same way that many people have, my grief was actually about recognizing limitations of my own sort of lifestyle. But I think I was first introduced, not in these exact terms, but to the idea of ecological grief in terms of thinking about um, land, um, land custodianship, ownership, colonization. And I've been very fortunate to have a number of colleagues, friends, and teachers um, who work through Indigenous ways of knowing, um, and I've learned a lot directly and indirectly about the connection of culture to land. And coming from Saskatchewan, and then also living in Australia, we have overly dependent. We have an over dependency on economic connection to natural resources. Um, and so I've been thinking a lot about that in terms of how to live a sustainable life and how a culture can have a sustainable future as well. And the grief for me, I guess, comes in that uh, as an individual, we don't often feel we have the agency to affect that sort of change. Which is why I do a lot of collective work, both in the art world, politically, even research collaborations as well. So that idea of sort of staying with that trouble, I guess you could say, to quote Donna Haraway, um, and to do it with friends. So we've been hosting over lockdowns, like a series of reading groups and things like that to share this space. Um, because it's really about, I guess, realizing that we don't know it all. We actually need to unlearn a lot of the things that we thought we knew very well.
Public policy professor Eric Beinhocker. Humankind is in a race between two tipping points. The first is when the Earth's ecosystems and the life they contain tip into irreversible collapse due to climate change. The second is when the fight for climate action tips from being just one of many political concerns to becoming a mass social movement. The existential question is, which tipping point will we hit first? Well, let's move on to your work. There's different branches, as you say. You're polyvalent, we would say in French. So where to start? I know your work from community engaged practices and research and theory, but we were just talking earlier about the connection between environmental activism and community engaged arts and the larger social work around social change. So maybe you can just jump in and tell us about some of your research and how it might relate to, say, the ecological crisis.
Yeah, sure. That's a big question. I'm actually not sure where to jump in. I mean, I could probably think about how I got started and why I was interested in doing research. And so, as you know, I was working with Commonweal Community Arts in Saskatchewan for many years, working with incredible colleagues and doing some really interesting work, supporting artists to work often in non-art contexts and thinking about the role of art in social change. So whether it was artists working in hospitals or prisons or in community with young people, with older people, so on and what have you. Um, I used to think a lot about this idea of, community engaged arts. Was it actually about engagement? What I've realized since is my interest in working with people that are unlike me. So it's about collaboration. And my sort of focus is actually about bringing often disparate ideas and people together to look at particular issues, social, environmental, cultural issues, local or global, to work through both understandings, within that space, but also to do things together to forge those relationships and realize ideas through aesthetics or other, through art making. So it's really about, collectivity, collaboration, and individual contributions to projects. So when I came to Australia, I was very much interested in the sort of question of, if we're working towards social change, whose change, is this, and how do we know we're achieving it? And I still haven't answered that question, other than the fact that it's not my job to place value on other people's cultural activities or expressions through art. So I guess, back to the reality question is that, there's multiple realities, and we need to have a pluralist understanding of what's important to people. So just because I can't understand other ways of knowing doesn't mean it doesn't exist. So that sort of reality of understanding, I guess, pluralism, which is a difficult thing to enact into, political systems like democracy and things like this. But I guess I've had the privilege of learning a lot in terms of sort of intercultural capabilities in Canada with generosity and invitation of First Nations communities, but also in Australia, similarly with First Nations community, but also in this region, sort of the Asia Pacific region. So we have a lot of international students from Southeast Asia as well, China, Indonesia, and whatnot. So starting to understand a little more about how other people see the world, and in particular in my area, supporting those students or communities to make work, to question, to resolve some of their ideas around um, art in public space, primarily, is where I'm working, which obviously has strong connections to environmental issues.
Well, the word I read one piece about residencies that I found really interesting because one of the issues that I'm working on is sort of the role of the arts. I mean, we all know that the arts play an important role in our lives because we sing songs and we read books and everything. We engage in conversations, but it was interesting that you would put your finger on the process of engagement when somebody is outside of their comfort zone or outside of their home. So maybe you could talk about that specific piece of research, because it kind of triggered a thought in me about that we do a lot of residencies in the sense that we're often going somewhere else to get stimulated or to collaborate, but it's fraught with issues, right? You bring your baggage with you, and there's certainly things to be aware of when you go into someone else's spaces, even if you're invited. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So I started excuse me. I started researching socially engaged artist residencies as an extension, I guess, to critically reflect on my own practices of working in and with communities. And I really started from a position of critique, actually. So, questions around carbon footprints of travel to sort of far flung places, but also the unintended colonial consequences um, of going into a community that's not your own, and all of the cultural complexity that can happen, even like you say, when there is an invitation or a reciprocity, collaboration in that work. It's complicated work. And so I started writing this book before lockdown, and I had sort of built this structure about, looking at the transnational artist and frameworks of international development or contemporary art, and worked through a range of different models around, why hosts want to, which might be in institutions or it might be communities, want artists to come and work in their community. So I was looking at the lovely St. Peter's Abbey at Munster, Saskatchewan, Benedictine monastery, who host artists and writers, and wondering, like, why do they want artists to come and spend time there? The artists end up, creating incredible work, strong networks amongst each other, but also participating in the community, perhaps, helping in the organic garden, going for long walks, those sorts of things. And Abbot Peter actually said to me, who was sort of the host for that, he said, well, why wouldn't we want artists to be here? We have something that's beautiful and we want to share it, right? So that's one of those values around art, right? So that's the autonomy of art. That's the sort of question around beauty. But then there's a lot of other reasons why institutions want artists to work within communities. And it could be a gallery, a local government, a whole range of organizations who will host artists. And it's about, engagement, and sometimes with communities that don't have access to the arts or public life in general, to be able to engage people in their local place and ideas. But then, of course, there's the other approach where artists are creating opportunities and collaborations themselves and bringing institutional support or whatnot. So this sort of artist-led collaboration is really interesting to me, and more we're seeing themes around environmental concern, collapse, and anxiety come out through these collective residency activities. I was thinking recently about one residency I went on, which was called Time, Place, Space. And so it's through Arts House in Melbourne and a number of other partners. But basically, a group of artists go out and camp for 10 days, exchange practices, and explore these big questions without the facilities, the gallery, the theater, the stage, without audience as well. So more and more we're seeing artists working in these collective ways to start to kind of question these big issues. But the book actually came to a conclusion in thinking about artists that are now leaving the big cities and stopping travel, not wanting to be what we call the FIFO worker here in Australia, where one goes into a community to mine iron ore and then takes that value out of the community, leaving very little behind, sometimes just a big hole, if you know what I mean. And so the conclusion of the book is thinking about artists connecting within their own communities and spaces, and this sort of leaning towards local vorism. So you see artists working in collaboration in their own communities with traditional custodians, working on permaculture projects, working on really interesting things at neighborhood houses and whatnot. Sort of back to the old days where that sort of creative organizing of community arts or cultural development. But at the same time, those artists can work autonomously in their own practices. So it was interesting timing to think through these questions, because during the pandemic, I had a moment of, oh, does this even matter? Like, all this thinking about value and policy and practices, does it even matter? Like, people are unwell and dying, communities are collapsing. And it actually made me realize this sort of commitment to the local is more and more important in our practices, I think. To be able to situate self within that sort of social and that soil.
Well, it's not a new idea, of course, but
No.
we have, because we could, traveled a lot, and I suspect we're going to travel less for ethical reasons and also just barriers around health and whatever. But I'm interested in the idea of community engaged arts becoming more of a common practice across the board in the arts, because there are different schools of thought. There are those who will say that it's a specialized practice that requires very particular training and showing to be done under certain conditions with certain professionals, and I can see why, because if you're working with, say, a group of youth or on a complex issue like, land rights or something like that, you would want to do that. On the other hand, there's talk that the arts need to engage more with community, and there's so many different ways of doing it, so many different levels of in the toolkit, so to speak. So where do we fall on that? Is there a sense that this is an open toolbox for anybody to use, or is it more specialized practice because of the particular relationships that need to be developed? I know this is a big topic, but my listeners might not be very familiar with community engaged arts or participatory arts, and I've always been fascinated by them because I've seen great results. I saw when you were at Commonweal with a project in the Grasslands Park, how powerful and how it stays with you, and how when you're involved in a artwork, it's different than being passive, So I know I'm asking a lot of you here, but could you just give insights on how that toolkit of community engaged arts, which is now 30, 40 years old, could be used by non-specialized artists to work on social issues like the just transition, the ecological crisis, and that kind of thing?
That's a big question.
Yeah, they're all big questions. Sorry.
That's all right. That's all right. I mean, these are the questions that we, grapple with through teaching. So, as I mentioned before, I'm, a researcher. I'm currently working as a research fellow and senior lecturer at RMIT University in Melbourne, and there's a whole range of practices which are, I guess, distinct within the field. So, you've sort of set up this binary of, is it a creative method, or is it an artistic, like, is it a creative method for engagement, or is it actually an artistic practice that requires particular skills? I mean, there's a lot of debate in the field, as you know. But one thing that we do know is that socially engaged art, which includes artists, requires a certain amount of skills and attention to aesthetics, which is, driven as an extension of one's own practice. They may have a number of facilitative tools with a community, but it is all driven by a particular set of ethics. So, unlike other disciplines, it's not about how the paint works with the canvas or necessarily, um, color theory. It may include some of those methods if the artist comes from that sort of visual ontology. But as you know, there's a lot of community engaged or socially engaged practice that comes out of theater or performance trajectories as well. So on the other scale, we can look at community-based arts as actually coming out of a history, a history of, from the 60s and 70s of community organizing around the environment, around gender, around cultural identity politics, and whatnot. And there's, the workers' theatre in Australia, the disability arts movement across many parts of the world. The example I often use is like Chicano Mexican artist murals. There's all of these sorts of overlapping movements where artists were engaged in opening up broader dialogue. So these were sort of politically motivated approaches. Then, coming after that, and definitely overlapped as well, many Western governments decided that art and culture was a public good. And there was a move for access to the arts, which was sort of the advent of children's festivals and community arts engagement, finding ways for larger institutions to open up their audiences as well through subsidized tickets and things like that. But this sort of second phase around like what I'm calling community engaged arts was not so much about those different voices creating artworks, but they were more a part of something, which was a bit of a institutional drive. And then more recently, we still have all of these other movements happening, but there has been a take up of socially engaged and community engaged arts back into the institution. So it's only in the last few years where I've been curating exhibitions or making art in an institutional framework. Like it used to be back alleys, neighborhood centers, prisons. But now the institutions are actually seeing the value in these works. Like you look at the Blake Prize shortlist this year, they're all collectives and socially engaged artists. Whereas, up until 5 years ago, it was painters and sculptors. So there's this shift in the contemporary art world as well to embrace art and social practice. So there's a lot of different theoretical frames that you can look at. And not to overcomplicate it, but I guess what it means is that it's a really diverse, active, and alive field where it's constantly, critiquing itself and making sense in new ways.
Well, what I've noticed is that there are more and more artists interested in engaging with the climate crisis in different ways. Some are actually creating tools for measurement. There's a project based on Julie's Bicycles tools that called Creative Green here in Canada. That's a good thing because then organizations will be able to measure their footprint. This has little to do with art practice. This has to do with just operations. But somehow the idea of engaging with your own behavior, like your own footprint as an artist, your own community, and as artists are looking how they can contribute and be part of the solution in a way. I'm finding there's a tremendous variety of approaches, and some are doing it through their art practice, and others are doing it by citizen engagement, like literally getting people together to talk about the issue. But their art is still in there because they're coming from art practice, right? So I'm kind of mapping out, and I know you do this as well, mapping out the different ways that artists are working and what are the gaps. Sometimes it's a funding gap, sometimes it's a knowledge gap, sometimes it's a mentorship gap. I know that Judith Marcuse and colleagues in Vancouver are doing really good work around that. So right now, I'm feeling pressure, and I think we all are, to deal with the climate emergency, because if we don't, there are consequences that are unbearable. And then looking at the role of the arts. So I guess that's my question is, at this point today, what do you see some of the gaps or some of the barriers for the arts, regardless whether they're community or social engaged or not? Because broadly, what are some of the things that the arts could do more of, and what are some of the barriers or things that we need to address to get there?
Writer Robin Wall Kimmerer. The land is the real teacher. All we need as students is mindfulness.
Sure. I think, if we're thinking about mapping, I think there's probably three angles on it. And the first would be institutional responsibility. So, like you're saying, mapping carbon footprint, but the amount of waste that goes into shows and transport for exhibitions, things like that, because of material practice, has to be rethought and reconfigured. Really, really brief example for you. I'm working with a group of students, master's students in Melbourne, Japan, Hong Kong, and China to create artworks for a public art festival at a place called Wanio Island, which is 5 hours off the coast of Shanghai. And the island is a very small island with about 500 people that live there, over 60, with a sort of fisherman's culture. Now, the local government is working on some new redevelopment and thinking about the potential for cultural tourism, which is why they're creating this public art festival. So, super interesting in terms of how do you create artwork for sight unseen and all those sorts of things. But our students are telling us, we don't want to fabricate something large that'll have an impact on that island. We want to create works that are more ephemeral. We want to create works that can be made from materials that can be reused, or from existing materials that are in place. So artists, young artists, are thinking very differently about how they make work, as opposed to some of us old school folk, or even commissioners who are funding and supporting this type of work, thinking about sustainability and the challenges of gentrification all combined up. So the first kind of area I'm saying is, institutions need to have that filter, right? Like we used to talk about the triple bottom line, economic, social, cultural. Now we need, environmental in a very big way. I think the second area is really about artists actually just thinking in a very different way, which is this sort of broader ecological focused. So understanding the relationship between the environment, culture, the social, and the economic, that it's not a separate thing. It's not about making art about the environment. I don't think it's a discrete discipline like environmental art. Um, some people would argue with me that it isn't, but it's the same thing with socially engaged art or environmental art. It's all art with different methods and modes. And then finally, you're right. I think the real gap is around training and support and mentorship because like with the socially engaged art practice, even back in Saskatchewan, I remember a number of young artists wanting to work in communities not their own or in prisons and things like that. And we don't send them off to art school. We send them off with senior artists who have done this work over a very long time, and the support and relationships they can have, rather than making it's not that we don't want people to make mistakes, because that's actually quite productive, but when there's too much at stake, which is community or the environment, we need to be able to support people to move into those areas when they're new, I guess you'd say. So yeah, I think going forward there's a lot that the arts can do. Philosophically, art is one of the only places that we can still ask these questions, play out politics, and negotiate ideas. Further, art isn't about communicating, climate disaster. Art is about creating space for people to think through some of these issues
and to feel feel a lot of things. Each other's emotions, to put yourself in the place of the other, and the other can be another living being like a tree or a bird, and that sounds a little esoteric, but I've experienced that kind of sensitivity, in the sense that when you just kind of take away the barriers and you see what's really going on, is that we're living in a way that's disrespectful of our peers, who are all people, and we can change our behavior if you just kind of wake up to what you've been learned, what you've been taught, to how you've been taught to live. And this whole Conscient podcast is a re-education for me. That's why I appreciate talking to you and others. It helps me, and it hopefully helps others break out of some of the molds that we've fallen into. Oh, that doesn't seem possible, or we can't do that. Well, why couldn't we? Why? And there's Go ahead.
Yeah. Absolutely. I was just going to say, we don't need to extend ideas from, romanticism, where it was, man versus nature. Like now we understand through post-humanism and affect theory and other ideas that we are nature. And we need to be in good relations with our more than human companions, I guess one could say. Mm. Absolutely.
So we're almost done, but is there anything else, Marnie, that you wanted to say or that we haven't covered that would be important for our listeners to know about in your universe?
So many things. So I think it's a great place to end, actually, Claude. You and I could talk for weeks, actually. So it's been really lovely to reconnect, and I hope to continue this conversation into the future.
Well, I think we will, and especially you and Jen Ray, who I also interviewed, and other Canadians living abroad. Okay. There's an interesting connection there between what you know about Canada and then what you're learning, and then those connections I think will be all the more valuable as we go forward. So thank you very much, Marnie, and we will talk again.
Great. Thanks, Claude.